There is a long-standing discussion in ethics about the moral significance or not of spatial distance. It turns out that discoveries on moral psychology are directly relevant to this discussion. So let's start with a very simple idea. You could help somebody, but you don't. You don't help that person. How bad is that? How bad is that? Well, you might think, look, there are various factors that can affect how bad that is. So, for example, how much need the person was in, whether there are other people around who were better placed to help, and so on. Now, here's a question. Could it be that facts about your distance from the person, or the distance of the means that you might use to help them from the person, could those facts about difference, in and of themselves, make a difference to how bad it is not to help them? Singer and many other philosophers have said that it can't. Francis Kamm has argued that indeed they can. But what we'll see when we look at the details of their argument is that they're relying on claims about moral psychology. That's why it's so relevant to us. So here's Singer. He starts off a very famous paper by saying the whole way we look at moral issues, our moral conceptual scheme, needs to be altered. And I find this fascinating because you kind of think, well, how are you going to step outside the way that we look at moral issues in order to see that they're going to be altered? There's kind of something interesting and puzzling here. And I think that's a puzzle that Singer actually solves in the paper. He explains how it is that you might step outside the way that we look at moral issues and see that they need to be altered. So that's kind of an interesting result in itself. Now, what most people take from this paper is not lots of detailed argument, and there is very interesting stuff in there. Most people take one example from this paper. Singer puts it like this: if I'm walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbour's child 10 yards away from me, or a Bengali whose name I shall never know 10,000 miles away. Now, the thought that Singer has here is this: if somebody failed to pull their neighbour's child out of a shallow pond when the child was 10 yards away from them, that would be regarded as a sort of monstrous act. That would just be horrible, I mean, how would you, I don't know, you just couldn't begin to deal with it. But take the same situation and introduce a bit of spatial distance, and according to Singer, the mere fact of spatial distance makes the whole thing just much less demanding. People don't think that you're a monster, even though the means to help the child 10,000 miles away are available to you. Interesting. All right, now Francis Kamm develops this idea, and she notes that lots of ways of setting up the drowning child story involve various confounds, so that spatial distance gets confounded with how easy it is to help somebody or something like that. So she constructs a pair of cases that she calls far alone and near alone, and her idea is as much as possible to remove these confounding factors and make it that just the distance is different. So far alone goes like this: I know that in a distant part of a foreign country I'm visiting, many children are drowning, and I alone can save one of them. To save the one, all I must do is put $500 I carry in my pocket into a machine that then triggers, via electric current, rescue machinery that will certainly scoop the child out. Far alone. Now, I think that many people will have the view here that, of course, it would be wrong not to take the $500 out of your pocket and put it in the machine. Right? But how wrong does that seem to you? How wrong does that seem to you? Contrast, says Kamm, near alone. It's very similar. I'm walking past a pond in a foreign country that I'm visiting. I alone see many people drowning in it, and I alone can save one of them. To save one, just like before, I have to put the $500 into a machine and so on. Now, here's the thing. In this case, I take it that failure is clearly monstrous. So Kamm says if you compare these two cases, what you see is that failure to act in this case is monstrously bad, much more bad than failure to act in this case, far alone. So that's Kamm's idea. There's a moral difference between the two cases, or at least it seems that way from the judgments that people ordinarily make. Moreover, says Kamm, the difference in judgments that they make, the difference in these judgments is explained by distance. Now let's go back. We've got Kamm's cases. Let's go back to Singer now. We'll come to Kamm in a minute. So at the moment we're just using her examples. What's Singer's argument for saying that the whole way we look at moral issues needs to be altered? Well, here's one part of the argument. Now I think there's a lot more to Singer's argument than this, but this is part that's drawn a lot of focus and is directly relevant to us in moral psychology. So I'm focusing on this not because I think it's the most important part of Singer's argument, but because it's helpful to us thinking about moral psychology's relation to ethics. Premise. On reflection, many people judge that not acting in near alone is worse than not acting in far alone. And I encourage you to keep thinking about those cases. So this isn't one of those cases where you're just supposed to say, quickly as possible, this is what I judge. Have a good old look at those cases. Oh, look, you can rewind. I tell you what, you can pause it here. Have a good old look at those cases, have a good think, have a sleep on it, come back tomorrow, come back to it next week, okay? The claim is that on reflection, you're very likely to be among those people who judge that not acting in near alone would be worse than not acting in far alone. Right? Not everybody will judge that, but many people will judge that on reflection. Secondly, Kamm and Singer agree that the difference in judgments is due to the difference in distance between the agent, you, the potential helper, and the victim, the child who is in danger. Now, Singer says the difference in distance is not morally relevant. He concludes then that it's possible to be convinced that there is a morally relevant difference between scenarios, even when there's not. And now you can see why he might want to be saying that the whole way we look at moral issues need to be altered. So partly, although I don't think this is the deepest part of Singer's argument, I do think there's something brilliant about this as an argumentative strategy. It's a way of showing that there's some kind of internal inconsistency between dispositions to accept this one and dispositions to accept this one. There's kind of a problem there, an internal inconsistency that suggests that we need to change the way we look at moral issues. Brilliant piece of argument. All right, well done, Singer. But have a look at this premise here. The difference in distance is not morally relevant. Now, I've already mentioned to you, so Singer thinks that this is so straightforward and obvious that there's barely anything to say about it. Many other philosophers have agreed with that. So this I think most people would regard as very uncontroversial. But Kamm offers a contrasting view. So Kamm thinks that that claim is false, that distance can be morally relevant in certain very special cases. And she offers an argument for this claim. Now, her argument is interesting because this is an argument in ethics. So Kamm is a leading ethicist, one of the major figures in ethics, I suppose. And she offers an argument to say that distance can, as she puts it, alter our obligation to aid. The argument has two parts, but the most important part is the thing that she starts with. She thinks that we who distinguish between near alone and far alone do so because they involve being nearer or further away from the person who needs our help. So a large part of her argument is attempted to bolster the impression that we got from reading Singer back in the 70s that it really is distance here that's swaying our judgment about the two cases. The second part of her argument, so Kamm of course insists that in order to accept this difference on the basis of intuitive responses to the two scenarios, reflective but pre-theoretical responses, we also need some kind of theoretical justification. So she attempts to provide that. She wants to say there's a kind of theoretical justification for thinking about distance as morally significant. And here's what I think she says. She says, one has a moral prerogative to give greater weight to one's own interests. So it's a prerogative, you can do that, but you don't have to. And if you do give greater weight to your own interests, says Kamm, then it follows that you're under a duty to take care of what's associated with you, for example, the area near you. So this, I'm not saying this is compelling. I struggle with this. I can't quite see it myself. But as far as I can make out, this is Kamm's argument for the claim that distance is morally relevant from a theoretical point of view. So her idea is put these two things together and you see that distance turns out to be a morally relevant factor after all. So there's a kind of justification for the pattern of judgments that people make in the near alone case and the far alone case. What people are doing is exercising a moral prerogative to give greater weight to their own interests, and then following from that, they have an associated duty to take better care of things which are nearer them than things which are further away from them. So the pattern of judgments corresponds to a moral principle. So says Kamm. So here's what's interesting. The famous dispute is between Singer and Kamm on whether distance is morally relevant. And this is clearly a dispute in ethics. It's a dispute about an ethical principle. What's taken for granted by the two, or rather, I mean, Kamm argues for this at great length, but what everybody agrees about here is that the difference in judgments is actually due to the difference in distance. Or more carefully, this is I think how Kamm would put it, there are scenarios where one would make a moral distinction, our judgments would indicate there's a morally relevant distinction between the two, and the difference that causes us to make such a judgment is distance, a difference in distance. That's what I think Kamm would say. So she's defending this premise too. But it turns out that since Kamm published her 2008 book, Nagel and Waldmann showed that this is actually false. And interestingly, they use, in a very careful way, Kamm's own insights to demonstrate this experimentally. So let me start by showing you the kind of thing they're doing. So this isn't the core part that we're interested in. There's a long series of experiments. I think this is the fourth experiment, perhaps might be 4B, something like that. So what they're suggesting is that when people make judgments and distinguish scenarios, distance is often confounded with other factors. So for example, sometimes distance is confounded with how far you would have to go in order to help someone. When you are further away, you have to go further than when you're nearer. And as they point out, that might actually influence people's intuitions about the obligation there is to help, because you might reasonably think that the more costly it is to help, the lower the obligation on you, other things being equal. And indeed, so what they do is they look at cases where the confounding factor is present, so the need to traverse the distance is present, and they compare that with cases where the need to traverse the distance is absent, so the confounding factor is absent. This is the basic idea. So you've got a group of scenarios where you notice initially distance is confounded with another irrelevant factor that's not really distance, some other factor, but where it's associated with distance. And then what you try to do is to adjust for that irrelevant factor and see how that influences people's judgments. And what you can see here is this: when you include the confound, so the person needing help is both far away and you need to traverse that distance to get to the person, people do indeed think that there is less of an obligation for the far than the near person. But there's an interaction effect, because when you remove that confound and you make it clear that there's no necessity to traverse the distance to travel, the difference between the two cases goes away. So you get an interaction between the presence or absence of the confounding factor and the judgments about the moral scenarios. So in this way, Waldmann and Nagel are able to show that although many things associated with distance make a difference, none of the cases in which distance itself is supposed to make a difference actually does so. Now, when they come to Kamm's case, so they consider Kamm's case and draw quite heavily on her theoretical insights. When it comes to Kamm's case, they draw on something that Kamm herself notices. This is that as she characterises near alone, there's a direct perceptual relation between you and the children. So of course there's an implication that their drowning is going to weigh very heavily on you. It's going to be very traumatic to be in the presence of children drowning. Whereas in the fire alone case, the harm being caused is far less salient to you. So there's a difference in how salient, as Kamm puts it, the harm is to you. It would be very salient in this case, and in here it wouldn't be terribly salient to you at all. So you'd probably sleep quite well after fire alone, and you probably would need, well, it wouldn't be good. It wouldn't be good to encounter near alone. So it could be that difference which is making the effect. Now, Kamm herself says explicitly that she thinks that's not the case, and she argues at great length on the basis of various theoretical considerations that this couldn't be the case. But Nagel and Waldmann, of course, just do the experiment. They just do the experiment. So what they do is they adapt the near alone and far alone cases and consider whether or not the effect of salience there is what's making the difference, or whether it's distance, or whether it's some combination of the two, right? And I suppose what they expected to find is that some combination of the two things kind of go together, so that greater distance kind of mitigates the effect of salience or something like that. But that's not what they found. They found that the difference is not attributable to distance per se. Rather, the difference can be traced back entirely to the confounded factor, salience. They could say informational directedness, but they mean the same thing. What's the relation between the person and the victim? Is it that you're seeing, or is it that you just know more indirectly about it? When they have constant levels of directness, so you're in every case seeing, or in every case merely knowing without seeing, distance ceases to be of moral relevance to people. So here, Nagel and Waldmann have taken up Kamm's proposal and I think quite convincingly refuted it. And this is surprising because before Nagel and Waldmann did this study, I think it's fair to say that most researchers in this area assumed that distance was likely to be causing a difference in judgments. And indeed, there was some preliminary evidence to that effect. So, for example, Kumar and Campbell quote an undergraduate thesis which appears to have supported that claim. Presumably didn't sort of look after the confounds very carefully. So Nagel and Waldmann have shown that this claim is false. Interesting. Where does that leave us? Why is that relevant to us? After all, what we're concerned about is whether discoveries in moral psychology can provide support for or undermine ethical principles. Well, the first thing is to look at Singer, right? So Singer wants to argue that the whole way we look at moral issues needs to be altered. Now, this is, I think, indirectly relevant to Singer because it shows that Singer, in supporting this argument, shouldn't appeal to distance in particular. But what you notice about Singer's argument structure is that it doesn't depend on just distance. And indeed, Singer in the paper doesn't particularly emphasise distance. So what Singer usually emphasises is whether there's personal involvement or not. The personal involvement, which he thinks is not morally relevant. So as long as there is some factor that Singer and you agree is not morally relevant, then his argument will work. So what I want to suggest is this, that this argument from moral psychology, Nagel and Waldmann's discovery, is not of dramatic significance to Singer's argument. But if we now look at Kamm's argument, I want to suggest that this is of dramatic significance. And the first thing I want to say is you might think, look, I must be misreading Kamm, because Kamm is this, I don't know, sort of archetypal, thoughtful ethicist who has these sort of intricate arguments. Indeed, her book is called Intricate Ethics, all written down. How could she possibly have got commitments in moral psychology, commitments to empirical claims that can be scientifically refuted? That doesn't seem right. But there are places where Kamm makes it very clear that her argument depends on these empirical premises. It may be suggested, says Kamm, that proximity matters, proximity distance. She's very careful, I'm being a bit less careful here. The difference doesn't matter for us, although it is very important. It may be suggested that distance matters as a heuristic device that correlates with morally significant factors, although it's not itself morally significant. But I doubt that these factors explain the apparent moral significance of distance. And despite that odd style, I doubt that. She's not actually relying on, she's relying on the premise here. It's not those factors, and she's argued at length, theoretically, that those factors shouldn't be regarded as explaining the moral significance of the distance, and yet they do. So the first thing is, I think it's clear that Kamm is relying on empirical premises which discoveries in moral psychology can confirm or refute. The second thing is, I think that Kamm's argument for the conclusion that distance is morally significant in a certain way is clearly refuted by the discovery of moral psychology. That's because the first premise that she relies on has been shown to be false by Nagel and Waldmann. So if our question is, can discoveries in moral psychology undermine or support ethical principles? Well, here's a yes, right? If Kamm's method is not completely misguided, then it looks like Kamm is able to show that distance, or at least present an interesting argument, that distance is morally relevant, and the discovery of moral psychology just cuts off that argument. We shouldn't go too far though. What we haven't shown, of course, is that Kamm's conclusion is false. What we've done is provided an objection to the argument, and if the objection works, it shows that her argument doesn't work. It doesn't follow, of course, that the conclusion there is false. It's still possible to accept that this is true. Perhaps there are other grounds to accept it. Now, the last conclusion, this is much more tenuous, is this. What we notice here is that Kamm starts from and puts most weight on premise about why people make different judgments about the two cases, near alone and far alone. And on the basis of that, she then constructs a kind of rationalization for a principle about distance, using all kinds of further cases to sort of narrow it down. But this is now looking a little dubious, because it looks like what's happened is she's made a incorrect assumption about why people make certain judgments, and then constructed a sort of rationalization for that, when in fact that pattern doesn't exist in the first place. The basis for it is illusory. So that post hoc rationalization process looks a bit dubious. Now just here I think we might draw a conclusion. You see, when I read Kamm, I'm impressed. This is very subtle argument. It's very compelling. It's difficult to see anywhere you might stick in an objection. It's all very careful. It's full of lots of distinctions, and it draws you in. It's really quite compelling. But then you think, but if what's really happening here, despite it seeming so convincing, is that it's a kind of post hoc rationalization for a series of unestablished and perhaps quite often false, certainly sometimes false, beliefs about why people make judgments based on informal observation and individual reflection, then it seems that we shouldn't accept this. We shouldn't accept this. There might be something wrong with the method as a whole. Right? Now, I'm not saying we've got an argument for that more radical conclusion, but it doesn't look good. It doesn't look good. When you've produced justification for a principle which you thought needed to be justified on the basis of an assumption which turns out to be false, you've got to wonder, well, how did I manage to get that justification in the first place? How did I manage to convince myself that I had justified the principle? It could turn out, of course, that this justification is in good order and there's some other reason, not this one, but some other reason for thinking that distance is right. But on the face of it, it looks like a lot of the work that philosophers are doing is a kind of post hoc rationalization, and that ought to worry us. That ought to cause us to be more skeptical about this work in ethics. So where are we? The question is whether scientific principles could, scientific discoveries could undermine or support ethical principles. And I think anybody who thinks that Kamm's broad approach is okay should think that the answer is yes.